Those of us who grew up watching the Jetsons, Blade Runner, Back to the Future 2, and The Fifth Element were sure that the world would have flying cars by the turn of the millennium, and many of us still have our fingers crossed. Toyota, Hyundai, Airbus, and Kitty Hawk, which is a project by Google co-founder Larry Page, are still racing to make the world's first vertical takeoff and landing vehicle for commercial use, and if successful, they could capitalize on a fledgling industry that is slated to be worth $1 trillion by 2040. Joby Aviation and Archer Aviation are already working on making electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicles. And would you believe that even Uber, Airbus, Boeing, and of course the US Air Force are not that far behind? How did they get to this point after more than 100 years? Well, let's take a look at the history of flying cars, which is just as bizarre and frustrating as you might expect. It is no surprise that the idea of a flying car has been around for centuries, and Leonardo da Vinci himself conceptualized a flying vehicle though. But it wasn't until the early 1900s that the idea of building a flying car was in the works. The first concept of an aviation vehicle that a person could drive was patented way back in 1910 and 1917. Hammond Curtiss created Autoplane, a drivable winged automobile that was able to lift off during its early test runs, but it wasn't able to make a full and proper flight. When World War I broke out, Curtiss, which is also considered by many to be the founder of the American aircraft industry, gave up the project. Henry Ford came up with the idea of an experimental single-seat aircraft that he dubbed the Ford Flyer in the 1920s. He envisioned putting a plane in every garage and introduced Flyer, aka the Model T of the air, to the world as a single-seat aircraft that was marketed to the common man. It was light, easy to operate, and compact for quick storage, but sadly his plan never materialized. Ford's friend and company test pilot Harry J. Brooks disappeared while taking a long-distance test flight on one of the prototypes, and Ford put his work on hold for some time. One of his designers, William Bushnell Stout, who had left to pursue designing aircraft and automobiles, built a series of 4 prototypes of flying automobiles that he called Sky Car between 1931 and 1944. He hoped for private aircraft suitable for the average American to attract the general public, but because he had launched them at the height of the Great Depression of the 1930s, the idea tanked, and their successor, the roadable Sky Car 2, was a miss as well. Keen to take up the newfangled concept, the U.S. Bureau of Air Commerce commissioned the Pitcairn Autogyro Company to develop a roadable aircraft in 1935, and it came up with a 2-seat AC-35 Autogyro flying vehicle that had street speeds of 25 miles per hour and could take off and land in 52 meters of space. Although the prototype performed well, the initial price tag of $12,500 did not match the company's goal of an affordable $700 aircraft for the average family. And as fate would have it, World War II broke out and the development of a practical helicopter terminated the project. Later on, engineer, inventor, and pilot Waldo Waterman, who had previously worked with Curtiss, extracted and modified the engine of his Studebaker car and used it in his high-winged 2-seater monoplane called the Waterman Aerobile, which he flew for the first time in 1937. It was both low-cost and simple to fly, but production was shut down after 5 units because of the general disinterest in flying cars. The idea of the flying car continued to intrigue inventors and even led to the creation of the Conv Air car of the 1940s, which was just a sedan secured to the bottom of an airplane. Well, someone had to give it a try, right? It was followed by the Fulton FA-2 Airphibian, a roadable aircraft in 1946. It had removable tail sections and wings, but wasn't very practical and didn't catch on either. Perhaps the funniest attempt, depending on how you look at it, was the Canadians' attempt, which looked like a wobbly flying saucer. The Avro car was developed to be a supersonic vertical takeoff and landing fighter bomber in the early 1950s, and it floated on a cushion of air. Really cute to look at. Flying cars, or the idea of, at least became such a fad in the 1950s that Chuck Berry even released a song called You Can't Catch Me, describing an airmobile in 1956. The lyrics were based on Moulton Taylor's 2-seater Aerocar, which is hailed as the world's first practical flying car. It could fly a top speed of 110 miles per hour, had an on-road cruising speed of 60 miles per hour, and 300-mile range. The Aerocar's wings and tail could fold into a self-contained package to allow it to be towed behind a car like a trailer. After it took its first flight in December 1949, it was approved by the Civil Aviation Authority. However, only 5 were constructed, and sadly the Aerocar wasn't a commercial success either. The Ford Motor Company then created a 3/8 scale model of the Ford Volante Triatodyne in 1956, but it never made it past the concept stage. Not one to give up, Ford devised another concept hover car model named the Levicar Mach 1 in 1959, but it never saw production either, making his exit from the flying car game. The following year saw several successful and unsuccessful flying car attempts, including the Advanced Vehicle Engineers Mizar in 1973. It was one part Cessna Skymaster and one part Ford Pinto, but the problem was that it was easily combustible. Not a great design, but its engineer and pilot Henry Smolinski and AVE-VP Harold Blake preserved and took it on a test flight, which resulted in both their deaths. Among other follow-up attempts were Boeing's Sky Commuter concept vehicle in the 1980s, Britain's Parajet Skycar in 2008, and notably Paul Muller's Skycar, which he spent over 50 years conceptualizing and developing. He even listed it on eBay in 2017 with a buy-it-now price of $5 million. More recently, Germany launched an all-electric air taxi, the Volocopter, in 2011, and seems to be leading the race to make it a commercial success that is also easily accessible. On the other hand, and as always, not too far behind in the competition is China, with the EHang Autonomous Aerial Vehicle, or AAV. It is the world's first electric and eco-friendly passenger-grade autonomous aerial vehicle. And would you believe that it started carrying passengers in 2015? Makes me wonder if we should move to China. While you're trying to wrap your head around when this crept up on us, just know that Alauda Aeronautics in Adelaide plans to introduce the world's first crewed flying car race in the Australian desert next year. And in case you missed it, the UAE's Prime Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum has just announced that it will launch the world's first flying taxi service by 2026. Probably won't be a cheap taxi service. Thanks to that long and painstaking history and hard work, the future is already here, right? While we're not quite at the point where flying cars are a common sight, it's clear that the world has made progress. Who knows, in the not too distant future, we may all be flying to work instead of driving. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to write down in the comments what you think of flying cars.